Hello and welcome everybody to our COSP 10 special event. My name's Ian Tennant. I work at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. We're hosting this event here today in partnership with the US State Department. And during the event you will hear about the Global Organised Crime Index and how it can be used to analyse corruption and the crime-corruption nexus. I would like to ask first of all for Maggie Nardi to come to the podium and give us some opening remarks. Ms. Nardi is the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the US State Department.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Ian. As Ian said, I am at the State Department in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and am responsible for everything related to transnational organized crime. But we have three primary areas. First one is corruption, also cybercrime, and illicit drugs. So as our keynote speaker, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield said this morning, in 2021, the Biden administration issued the first U.S. Strategy to counter corruption. And so the State Department's role in that is sort of multifold. That's probably not even a word. But we do capacity building around the world. We also support sanctions. We have a rewards program for information to arrest and conviction of corrupt actors. And we have a visa revocation program. And the ambassador said this morning that President Biden has just allowed Secretary Blinken to expand that visa revocation program, which up until now has only been for current or former government officials, which is good, but now we can do it for corruption enablers. So that is anybody, so anyone in the private sector as well. So now it is, there are more opportunities to try to impact the actions of corrupt actors. As we have been talking about all day, and you all know that, and that's why you're here, corruption is, it's a cancer, as the statement has been used multiple times today. It impacts everything. It impacts local economies, impacts stability, it impacts security, it impacts every aspect of our life. And frankly, in the US government, I would say this was an area where we didn't focus as much on the connection between corruption and transnational organized crime as perhaps we should have in the past, and that is something that we are starting to do more of. And one of the challenges, I think, is getting a better handle on where that corruption is, sector by sector. Do we have a sense of what's happening in the health sector, the financial sector? What percentage of organized crime is connected to corruption? So this is an area where I think we may be trying to explore more in the coming years. But data matters. So governments can focus on corruption, but we can't do anything alone. There are too many actors, which is why, if you've seen at the COSP, we had the first ever civil society event. We also had the first ever youth event. There are 2 days of private sector events. These are things that we would like to become standard and not to be special, and not things that have to be voted on in plenary sessions, but just to become the norm, because governments alone can't solve the problem, and in many cases we are the problem. And so we have to work together with others that have a different perspective, have different information, and can help us to solve problems both domestically and abroad. And in our capacity building, one of the challenges is determining where we put our money. How do we decide? Because corruption is endemic everywhere, including in the United States. Where do we put our funds, which are limited? And what we haven't had as much in the past until GI-TOC is the data to help us to decide where we can pinpoint where we spend our money. And I can promise you, the US Congress is calling us up to the Hill on a very regular basis to ask us how we are spending our money, where we are spending our money, and why we are spending it where we are spending it. Then the flip side of that, of course, is what results are we getting from that money. So we are working much harder now to use evidence-based decisions for where we place our funds because there are more and more crises around the world and funding is limited. And so we have to prioritize. So since its founding over a decade ago, the Global Initiative's very high quality research in our perspective has identified numerous emerging threats and gaps in global responses, and its evidence-based recommendations have been an invaluable resource to my bureau in the State Department in planning our policy and our assistance interventions. So we congratulate GI's leadership in developing and maintaining the Global Organized Crime Index, which you are going to be hearing about. Any government official, or frankly, anybody who's applying for a grant or for funds somewhere, you will know that data plays a very important role in securing those funds. And as I mentioned, for us as well, going to Congress, this is a critical element. And so we're very grateful to have more information to show as a basis for our decisions on where we are putting our dollars. The index also provides a uniquely useful and a standardized way to measure criminality and the resilience of societies. So there are a number of different indicators of corruption, but this indicator very helpfully pairs data on corruption with other crime trends. It also incorporates qualitative and quantitative data. So pairing the two together, you get a more fulsome picture. So governments, civil society actors, and other practitioners can draw on this empirical evidence to build practical responses against both organized crime and corruption. And it is helping us to move beyond anecdotal examples, which is what we have had to use in the past, to more fact-based planning for our assistance strategies and our diplomatic engagement. So the United States, as a result of this, because this is a very useful tool, we have provided the funding to support the design and the development of this index since 2019. And we encourage additional donors, because we do think this is something that everyone can benefit from, and also researchers to consider supporting GI's work in this field. So on behalf of the United States, I look forward to hearing GI's presentation and the perspectives of my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Deputy Assistant Secretary Nadi, thank you very much for those words, and thank you and all of your colleagues at the US government for all the supports you've given to us at the Global Initiative, including for the Global Organized Crime Index. We appreciate it a lot. I'm now going to introduce the team from the Global Initiative who are going to present to you today. On my right, Tuesday Reitano, the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative, Rumbi Matamba, Analyst on the Organized Crime Index team, and Laura Adal, the Director of the Global Organized Crime Index at the Global Initiative. So, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for coming. I realize for those of you like us who have come from time zones other than North America, it is late. So we will try and keep this light and interesting, and hopefully it will add value to your work. I am, as Ian introduced, Tuesday Reitano. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm thrilled to be here. To give you a little bit of insight for those who don't know our organization particularly well, and I recognize that we are a crime mandate-specific NGO in a corruption event, and we'll explain to you why that's an entirely appropriate thing over the course of this presentation. The Global Initiative is an independent civil society organization headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. We have coming up on 110 staff based in 46 countries around the world, focused around 7 regional organized crime observatories, 3 headquarters locations, which is where our thematic experts and large projects are based, and we have 3 national or special initiative observatories, including one on the conflict related to the Ukraine as an example. But the core of our organization is in fact a network. We refer to it, as we have done since our founding 10 years ago, as the network to counter networks. It is meant to be a network of positive activists, people who stand at the front line of combating organized crime and illicit activity. They come from governments, they come from the policy side, from law enforcement and state officials. They are private sector, they are researchers, they're civil society, journalists, academics, who have all of whom are contributing in positive ways to better understanding and better responding to the problem of the illicit economy and organized crime. The work we do is fourfold, broadly. The first is research and analysis, as both Deputy Secretary and Ian highlighted. We focus on a political economy approach to evidence-based research. Our work is intended to further the design and better implementation of policy responses. Our second line of work, therefore, related to that is facilitating dialogue. We emphasize a multi-sectoral approach, particularly bringing the voices of civil society to the table in conversations with state officials in order to build a better understanding of priorities and impacts so that responses can be designed to mitigate in the places where organized crime does the greatest harm. Our third line of work, commensurate to that, is we are a grant-making organization. So since 2019, we have had a small grants facility that provides support to individuals and very small grassroots civil society organizations in the countries most affected by the illicit economy to further their work and build networks and share experiences and collaboration. And finally, and increasingly in a world which I've no doubt in many conversations you've had is becoming more complicated to navigate, we are trying to pioneer responses that disrupt illicit markets. So we have a range of pilot programs that are looking at how to introduce friction into illicit markets, whether they be online or physical. And that is a complex intersection, I think, of interventions and engagements with different actors that inform all of the work we do, including the Global Organized Crime Index. I said in the opening that, for a crime NGO to be sitting at the Conference of the Parties of UNCAC is perhaps not immediate, but for us it is incredibly relevant. We find throughout all of our research and analysis that crime and corruption go unquestionably hand in hand, and the relationship between criminal and corrupt actors is becoming closer and harder to distinguish day by day, year on year. The fact that we do know that they are linkages is not news. It is both corruption and crime are referred to in both of their governing bodies, in the conventions, in the UN Transnational Organized Crime Convention and the UN Convention Against Corruption. The responses in both these conventions largely speak to a similar set of actions around rebuilding state institutions and the rule of law and criminal justice, as well as taking preventive measures and providing support to victims. But what we are seeing in our work is that not only do we need to see these conventions coordinate closer together, but actually that we need to start thinking more seriously about what it means to see these two criminal actors working as a hybrid threat system, which is undermining state responses all around the world. For us, the launching of an index has been a nearly 10-year endeavor. We have been designing and modeling how one would build an index to measure a concept as complex as organized crime. Much like the fight against corruption, organized crime is a hard to define set of issues. It encompasses a number of different illicit markets and illicit behaviors. The definition of what a criminal group is or a criminal actor is becoming increasingly complex, and the introduction of new forms of communication technology and other innovations again pushes the boundaries of the definitions in ways that we are struggling to keep up with in many ways, particularly in the framework of multilateral and international norms and standards. So one of the main goals for us in designing an index was to try and provide a set of nomenclature and a set of metrics around which we could work as an international community from a common set of baselines. We know what we have done is not perfect, that it can be challenged in many ways, but it is a complex endeavor, and at least we started, is the line that we've gone through. We have released 2 editions of our index, one in 2021 and one in 2023, just a month ago. Actually, it's about 2 months ago now, to be honest. So in September 2023, both of which were predominantly funded by the United States. We had a precursor to our global index, which was a pilot index just for Africa, and that has been running since 2019, and all of its modelling work was funded by the European Union and by the government of Norway. We went through a series of iterations in trying to design a methodology that would be robust enough to, first of all, stand up to criticism, second of all, really provide value. And this is not an index like many, which takes 3 or 5 indicators from the Economist Intelligence Unit, throws them together and produces a critical list that can be used to drive headlines and send shockwaves around the community for a brief period of time. We wanted to create something that would add value, that would provide insight to policymakers, that would be nuanced, that could be used in multiple ways, where the data is available and can be interrogated. What we found in our process, though, is this is challenging. There are very limited sets of metrics available, particularly quantitative. That data is very unevenly available and applied, and that directionality was a challenge. So, you can't use violence as an indicator necessarily, because sometimes violence goes up, and that's an indication of a market that is fragmenting. Sometimes violence goes down, that means the market is consolidating, or is it disappearing? So what we have developed is an expert-led assessment, which is based on masses of input data. And we have gone through, as this slide indicates, 6 rounds of initial profile development, scoring, reassessment, calibration, in order to provide something which we felt was robust, which would stand up to interrogation, to criticism, and which would provide enough nuanced data to be able to understand where those scores had come from. And as my colleagues will explain, we have created this as a very comprehensive resource tool that is publicly available, that is free for everyone, and that is up there for you to use. Rumbi.
Thanks, Tuesday. Just to add that while this is not a presentation on the index in full or its findings, because here we're looking specifically at the links between the results as well as corruption, we have made copies of the index available, and we would also invite you to have a look at our website, which is an interactive website, which will allow you to explore the data that we have collated over the last couple of years in more detail, as well as in various and comparative ways. But just to start us off, to familiarize ourselves with the index, looking at the index structure and its components, what the index does is that it measures both criminality and resilience to organized crime, recognizing that the two are often interrelated and that the tool is enhanced when we look at both sets of dynamics. The tool captures criminality by evaluating 2 components. This is the scope and scale of 15 criminal markets, which make up the base or the tail end of that pyramid on the screen, as well as 5 criminal actor types. And these include mafia-style groups, criminal networks, state-embedded actors, which I'll speak more on, as well as foreign actors and private sector actors. Now, while corruption in and of itself is not a standalone indicator within the index, the issue of corruption is intrinsically part of our definition of organized crime, which we define within the index as illegal activities conducted by groups or networks acting in concert by engaging in violence, corruption, or related activities in order to obtain, and this is either directly or indirectly, a financial or material benefit. And these activities may be carried out both nationally as well as transnationally. But in addition to this, corruption is also captured in all the subcomponents of the index in different ways. So, for example, within the criminal markets that you see on the screen there, corruption is considered an aggravating factor in the criminal market score. So in other words, all things considered, a market with a high degree of corruption will score higher than a market where corruption has not been identified. And then just in terms of criminal networks, corruption is not only a major feature of the state-embedded actors indicator, which I'll cover in the next slides, but the degree of corruption with members of the state apparatus is included as a criteria in the scores of other criminal actor types within the index. Just in terms of resilience, in evaluating resilience, the index measures the existence and effectiveness of 12 of what we call building blocks of resilience, and these are listed on the slide. And these have the potential to provide holistic and sustainable responses to organized crime, In evaluating corruption, especially under resilience, we have indicators such as government transparency and accountability that are explicitly corruption-focused, looking at the existence and efficacy of transparency as well as oversight mechanisms that can counteract corruption within state institutions. In addition to this, we also recognize that corruption is an impediment to the effective implementation of a whole range of resilience indicators. So from those listed on the slide, these would include effective law enforcement as well as fair and effective judicial systems. And so the level of corruption is also taken into account in many of the 12 different resilience indicators that you see listed within this slide. Just taking a closer look now at state-embedded actors, this indicator in particular incorporates this concept of corruption much more closely. And here, when we talk about state-embedded actors, we're looking at actors that operate from within the state apparatus. Over the last 2 iterations of the index, state-embedded actors were identified to be the most pervasive criminal actor type globally. And what this shows is that actors operating from within the state apparatus have enabled criminality across the globe. This is also demonstrated by the very high correlation that we found between this criminal actor type and the Corruption Perceptions Index, and my colleague will speak more on that. But on the slide in front of you here, we have the continental averages for state-embedded actors, and all continents saw a rise in their state-embedded actor score in the last 2 years, although this is to varying degrees, as you see with the various numbers on the slide. But the top scoring countries for this criminal actor type are also dispersed across all continents. But they reflect just how systemic corruption remains a serious issue and remains an issue where we have seen that the influence of state-embedded actors and their role in facilitating corruption and criminality is growing worldwide. So when experts evaluate the state-embedded actor scores, as Tuesday just mentioned, that the index is an expert-led assessment, they consider a wide range of criteria, and this includes, but is not limited to what is listed on the screen. So the number of officials influenced, the level of impunity, level within the state apparatus, as well as the degree and impact on state resources. According to these parameters, the degree to which criminality permeates state institutions varies from low-level corruption to full-on state capture. And in countries where state-embedded actors are assessed to have severe influence, corruption tends to be an extensive problem and plays an essential role in political environments to an extent that the state apparatus is completely infiltrated, which then leaves little room for other criminal networks to engage in criminality without the endorsement or authorization of state-embedded actors. And we found that this has wide implications on state resilience to organized crime as well.
Thank you, Rumbi. So now with all the data that we've acquired, we've been able to run correlations between different indicators and components within the index. And so you can see here on the top, we found a strong positive correlation between state-embedded actors and overall criminality under the index with a correlation of 0.74. So simply put, where criminality is high, there is a strong likelihood that state-embedded actors is also high, meaning that these actors are likely contributing in some way to organized crime, whether that be taking bribes or turning a blind eye or directly being involved in the illicit activities, furthering the interests of criminal groups. And, of course, this is particularly worrying because state officials and institutions who are meant to be the driving force to counter organized crime are being shown to undermine the state's ability to withstand criminality. And that is shown very clearly here in the negative correlation on the bottom of the slide between state-embedded actors and resilience. In other words, the lower the resilience a country has, the higher the likelihood of the presence of corruption actors. Sorry. Here we go. So in terms of resilience, the slide shows here the 2023 results for resilience rankings globally. And what's notable here is that while formal institutional measures like international cooperation and national policies and laws ranked highest consistently, other indicators like government transparency and accountability, again, the most corruption focus of resilience indicators, was found to be the lowest scoring resilience indicator under the index after victim and witness support. And so we can look to the UNTOC and UNCAC here as prime examples of this sort of disconnect. So while nearly all UN member states are parties to the UNTOC and the UNCAC, there really remains little incentive for states to actually implement the provisions of these normative instruments within their national contexts. And so, for example, along with similar provisions, we see in Article 32 of the UNCAC, specifically outlining the need for the protection of witnesses, experts, and victims, and for states to, quote, take appropriate measures in accordance with their domestic legal system, and to provide effective protection from potential retaliation and intimidation. Yet, as we see here in the index results, victim and witness support remains the lowest scoring of the resilience indicators, which again are assessed, as my colleagues have mentioned, by both their existence as well as their effectiveness. Now, another important thing to highlight here is the role of non-state actors. So this would cover civil society, the media, and the private sector as alternative sources of resilience, where they play instrumental roles in not only supplementing government interventions, but holding state institutions to account. And of course, driving more sustainable responses to organized crime through local engagement. And unfortunately, this indicator shows the largest decline among the 12 resilience indicators since 2021. Over the past couple of years, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, we've seen more restrictions on free speech and really a shrinking environment where non-state actors can freely work. And the data reveals that there is an inverse correlation between state-embedded actors and non-state actors. In other words, where actors are embedded within the states and they are among the chief perpetrators of criminal activity, civil society actors routinely find themselves within the crosshairs of government repression. And this is particularly concerning since in many countries, non-state actors were found by experts to be the strongest, or in some cases, even the only responders to organized crime, especially in countries where formal institutions were severely weakened by corruption. And here we have a quote by prominent Kenyan anti-corruption activist John Gitonga, who sums this up quite nicely. Now, the close relationship between resilience and corruption is again confirmed when we look at the correlations between the Global Organized Crime Index resilience scores and other external indices that are capturing corruption. And just for reference here, in case not everyone's familiar with correlations, a 0.79 to 0.89 reflects a strong correlation, and a 0.90 and above would be a very strong correlation. And so we can see here the 5 correlation coefficients on the right all convey basically the same message. Resilience and corruption, or rather the absence of corruption, are strongly linked, meaning that when anti-corruption mechanisms are in place, and there is a high degree of institutional transparency that is ensured, resilience measures against organized crime tend to be more effective, and vice versa, of course. And it's worth noting here that the correlations don't necessarily imply causation. So how corruption and resilience interact with one another can't be inferred from data alone. However, whatever the relationship might be, we know from the data that it is a very strong relationship, meaning that the issues of crime and corruption really are in lockstep. And the results show here that you basically need the same building blocks to strengthen resilience against both.
Just click. I think to conclude from where Laura left off, the consequences that we are seeing of this lockstep between criminality and corruption, or criminal actors and organized crime, is really playing out in, I think, a very troubling conclusion that we're finding both from our index but also from our qualitative research around the world, which is actually the greatest enablers of illicit behavior, whether crime or corruption, are no longer illegal. They're legal. They're legal things. So we have been advancing an analysis which looks at the four major drivers of illicit behavior, all of which are now enshrined into relatively well-accepted policies and laws and codified into behaviors. We put it into a pyramid because at the apex of the pyramid you have the free movement and the free essentially extraction of financial resources from the global economy through the offshore financial system, the proliferation of tax havens, the concentration of wealth, which is not only the concentration of wealth, but the concentration of wealth in anonymity, which allows that wealth to then be used and diverted around the world for whatever objectives those who hold it care to advance, whether that's through party political financing, lobbying, or merely the purchase of an overwhelming number of resources. What is troubling here for us is, of course, that this is something that they do without censure. And the rise in, incredibly stark rise in global income inequality has had profound consequences for people's life chances all over the world. This is coupled then with the growth of special economic zones and free trade zones around the world, essentially places that or echelons, black boxes in the global trade infrastructure, which allows the movement of valued commodities, the manufacture and morphing of commodities. And while neither special economic zones or free trade zones were necessarily created for the criminal classes, they have been very well used by them, as they have by kleptocratic regimes all over the world. And for us, one of the most troubling consequences is the extent to which these have reduced the efficacy of our enforcement, monitoring, and regulation tools. So they have created black boxes which our enforcement mechanisms cannot see into. And they are absorbing a growing portion of both trade and financial flows, to the point that the instruments that we use and focus on and propagate and invest significant national resources into advancing are just seeing less and less. This then coupled with a growth in informality, which has come in part due to the de-risking, which is ironically a response to the increasing regulation and regulations around anti-money laundering, countering financing terrorism, which have pushed economic activity out of the formal financial system and into informality. We're talking about cash-based economies. We're talking about artisanal extraction of resources, particularly natural resources and mineral resources. And while these, again, are not per se criminal, they have, again, reduced sight. They have reduced efficacy of responses and allowed us then to feel like we're making a difference, but actually seeing and having impact on less and less of our global economic growth. Finally, all of this underpinned again by the advances in communications technology, which I mentioned at the opening, which have changed the game around encryption, privacy, secrecy, anonymity. So once again there, we're seeing a large proportion of global wealth moved in ways that we both cannot identify, attribute, or understand. And for us, this is incredibly troubling. It is, though, all legal. And one of the challenges that we've had throughout the index is how do we reflect legal behavior in a criminality index? And there are within the indexes and the dynamics for consideration across the pillars of resilience, when we look at something like control over borders, how many points of entry and egress fall within special economic zones where there are limited regulatory capacity. Similarly, we look at the presence of tax havens and special tax jurisdictions within a country to when we look at economic integrity, for example. But more and more, the complexity of advancing an agenda which says illicit behavior, legal behavior, legalized behavior, advances criminal interests is one which challenges the fundamental foundations of the way that we respond to these problems. I'm just going to conclude with our last slide, which was one of our starkest findings out of the 2023 index. So as my colleagues explained, between 2021 and 2023, we introduced 5 new criminal markets to the Global Organized Crime Index, and they came very much in response to demand and to feedback. So when we launched 2021, we had 10 markets, of which 4 were drugs, 2 were environmental, so forth. And people said to us, you're letting off the countries where the money goes. You're not focusing enough on economic crime. You're focusing too much on physical crimes. So we introduced five new markets, one of which was economic crime, and lo and behold, the results of the 2023 index found that by a significant margin, economic crime was the most severe. So I think that for us, while there are other insights that the index can draw, what this conclusion brings is that we need to think more and more about how money moves within discussions about crime and corruption. And it really points to us that essentially we could talk about them as being interrelated, if not the same problem. So our conclusion to the essay question that this side event set, which is how can the Organized Crime Index contribute to analysis and response of corruption, we feel that we can rather strongly conclude that you could use our index as a proxy, almost in its entirety. Final slide, thank you, it was a question around data. So I kind of spoke to this in the opening remarks, but we know that the challenges of data, they have been discussed at length. There is an advanced conversation within the framework of Goal 16 of the SDGs. But what we wanted to close this conversation saying, and as a civil society organization we would be remiss not to, is that we really need to advance a broader participation in the data discussion. So for the moment, the majority of tools and instruments that look both at corruption and organized crime focus on state-generated data. What we have found in studies of the illicit economy is, in addition to all of the problems that there are with data, one of the problems with data around criminality and corruption is, of course, you put garbage in and you get garbage out. So there is enormous amounts of challenges in understanding the quality of data because it is so easily manipulated when it is entered. And what we have found to be very effective in both our qualitative and quantitative research is ensuring that data comes from multiple voices. So we have been experimenting with ways to draw data from the communities, from the people who are most affected by criminality and corruption. Civil society, community-led members, often people within the illicit economy themselves who would normally be considered invalid as sources. So we would like to sort of conclude this conversation around data analysis and underpinning with evidence the call for a constant effort to encourage and widen the sources of data that are fed into our decision-making processes and to make sure that the voices of civil society are heard. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, colleagues from the panel. I think everyone can see what an extraordinary piece of research and outputs the Organised Crime Index is. And I think you've been able to give us, in a very short amount of time, an insight into a very complex intersection between organised crime and corruption. We do have time for questions in the room. So we will open the floor now. We have the UNODC team have located a microphone, which is very nice of them. And Caden there will roam the room. So if I could ask people to raise their hands, and when they ask their question or make their comments, if they can say their name and which organisation or delegation they are representing. Okay, so maybe the gentleman here first. I'll take them in groups.
All right, thank you, Ian, for inviting me yesterday. My question is, well, brilliant work. This must be a lot of work. I'm Omar Yakubu from the Center for Fiscal Transparency in Nigeria. I will do some work on countering organized crime in Africa, actually. So I was eager when I spoke to you yesterday about this presentation. Mine is more of a question because I know you don't have time to show all those indicators. There are about 6,000 of them or so. So I'm thinking the major enabler of transnational organized crime is not just corruption, it's public sector corruption. There must be law enforcement officers involved, either at the immigration, the entry points, the exit points at the airports and all that. So statistically, do you give weights? What are the weights to those indicators? Because if you are trying to prevent something, there's a way you have to give weights to those indicators. If they are equal, you will not have a preventive mechanism. Those in statistics, we get what I'm talking about. Then the second thing, one of the indicators I saw from BTI, that's Office Abuse Prosecution, I want to assume, because I've not seen the other metadata behind those variables. Now, how do you, if the public sector corruption is a major enabler of transnational organized crime, do you measure, let's say, the level of prosecution of those public officers? Because if you are trying to solve a problem, let's say country A has a problem of human trafficking. Now, if you are not measuring the level of the enablers now, of how effective the mechanisms are, not just the laws, in practice, how effective are you prosecuting the major enablers and giving it their appropriate score? I think we may not have, because now I'm working towards a solution to the problem. So the data is good, we have the data, is well presented, but we should start thinking as civil society as informing countries of the solutions. And since we have identified the primary enabler, maybe we could find a way of, in your future index, to do these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I saw a hand. It's you, Angela. Okay, Angela May from UNODC. Caden, can you bring the microphone over?
Thank you. My name is Angela May. I'm the head of research at UNODC. So I want a comment and a question. A comment on the last slide that you had Tuesday on the data. And there is always a tendency to polarize. There is the government data and there is the NGO or the academia data. While I think there is the need to move discourse on the quality of data. It doesn't matter who produced the data, but the important thing is the how. And to have that filter, and at least what we do at UNODC is really to try to filter, according to data quality standards, and then triangulate the data also from different sources. Because we don't live at the time of a shortage of data. Actually, there's a lot of data around us. It's just the issue of how we mine, how to mine the data and how to collect, and again, how to filter the good data. And then a question on, again, the slide before the last. You talk about pervasive, right? I think that's the word. But what does it mean? Because I think when we think about organized crime, at least in the discussion, there is always that question, I don't know, almost obsessive sometimes, what is the biggest? Is it drugs biggest? Is it trafficking in person? And then the trafficking person community always say, that's the most profit are made on trafficking person. Then the wildlife community say the most profit are made by the wildlife community, and so on. So, but I think, I guess the word that you use, and I'm wondering if you use it on purpose, I guess there are different metrics again to see what is the biggest. And I would say more on the impact. What is the market or whatever you want to call it, that organized crime activity that are harmful, but also the harmful to whom? To the society, to the governance, to environment, and then are we talking about violence? Are we talking about profit made? All of these questions, I think they have a different answer in terms of thinking what market is the biggest.
Thank you, Angela. The lady in the row behind Angela.
You want me to stand? Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers of this side event and also the presenters. Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. My name is Betty Kamya, and I'm the Chief Ombudsman of Uganda and also the Inspector General of Government from Uganda. And, well, there are many things I'd like to say, but in the interest of time, I'll just say a few of them. One, civil society, sometimes especially, let me talk about Africa, where I have experience and experience, that civil society, sometimes their loyalty is to the funder. And the funders normally is outside our countries. And the funders sometimes have interests that are contrary or even hostile to the interests of the host country. So we take up the participation of civil society, most of the time very welcome, but sometimes with a pinch of salt. And I would like you to address yourself to the interests of civil society sometimes vis-a-vis interest of the host country and interests of the funders. That's one experience that we have in my country. I would like you to address yourself to that. And also to address, like the lady before me, I mean, corruption is like the proverbial elephant that wherever you touch, you get a different shape, and it is an elephant. So in the case of corruption, there is corruption by state actors, mostly because public resources, like in Uganda, we're actually taking on the civil service, because we're telling them public resources are actually given to accounting officers in the public service. But often they work with the private sector to manage these resources. So the two work together. If somebody has stolen money that should have been for constructing a road, it's maybe because they're getting a kickback from a contractor who is a private person, and the two normally the two work together. So we need to consider that as well. And finally, corruption in private sector, which is almost as big as corruption in government, especially in economies where the private sector is big. A procurement person in a private company or enterprise that inflates prices or buys low quality goods at premium prices, that is a lot of corruption. Also in the private sector, a human resource manager who hires a less deserving person, which they sell jobs for sex, for money, for all sorts, for nepotism, tribalism, all sorts of considerations. The corruption that happens in government happens as well in private sector. And I would like you to address yourself to that as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think given that we need to finish this event on time, we will ask the panel to respond to those questions and then close the event, and we can address the other questions afterwards in conversations. Thank you very much, representative from Uganda, for engaging and for the detailed questions there. So I'll ask the panel to respond.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'd like to pick up on actually two questions that speak to weighting and how do we measure pervasiveness of a criminal market. So when we look at criminal markets, and what we're asking experts to do is really assess two things with every criminal market. First, the monetary impact of the market, but also the non-monetary impact. And when we talk about non-monetary impact, what we try to do is provide some guidelines that look at different things, like, for example, criminal structures, actors involved, who are the number and nature of the people who are impacted by or actually involved in the market, how much violence is involved, whether the commodity in question is scarce, is it renewable, or is it not? Because what the index does is tries to take a neutral approach in terms of weighting. So we wouldn't take a judgment and say, okay, well, this criminal market is more valuable in terms of monetary impact, and therefore it is weighted more than another criminal market. And so we try to assess every criminal market, having experts assess every criminal market based on a collection of information, of quality data, and then with providing every score, they must justify the score that they provide and provide information on that. Go ahead, if anybody else.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of the comments. It is, and particularly to the representative of Uganda, I think a very valid consideration that one of the challenges that we've seen in this incredibly blurred line between state actors, criminal actors, is that they do not hesitate to use any lever of influence that they choose to apply, and that has often compromised civil society. Because civil society organizations have been created for the purposes of manipulating debates and discussions. They have been bought for the purposes of manipulating conversations and discourse and influence. And when we pushed out the triangle, disinformation, the disassociation between sources of funding are some of the strongest problems that we have to combat. So I don't think there's anyone would in any way challenge your assessment that we must look as cautiously at the agenda of civil society as we do with any other actor. And civil society has never intended in all cases to be neutral. They are partisan. Many civil society organizations are there to give voice to a specific set of agendas. What I will say about the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime is we try not to be one. We do take funding from a lot of organizations, but we do so on the conditionality that we have entire editorial independence. So our donors are not allowed to dictate what we write, what are the conclusions of our analysis are, or where we choose to disseminate them. And I think in those principles, if they are evenly implied, can give some integrity, we hope, to the key conclusions that come out of what we have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we have to wrap up as there is another event. So thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for the questions. And we look forward to continuing these conversations, not only in this forum, but in many other forums here and around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And please do take copies of the index report because they're really heavy and we don't want to take them home. Hey, I was like, is she joking? Am I joking?
You need some new glasses.
Oh, I'm so glad. Exactly. No, but didn't look. You
I'm
see,
no longer a fresh-faced
no, I didn't even look at